1242, a Mongol army stood at the Adriatic Sea. It had ridden from Mongolia, through Russia, through Poland, through Hungary, and arrived at the western edge of Europe in 3 years. The Knights of Christendom had tried to stop it at Legnica and at Mohi, and had been destroyed at both. There was nothing between this army and the Atlantic Ocean with any realistic prospect of resistance. Europe, as a political entity, was about to experience what Russia and China and Persia and Baghdad had already experienced. Then the army turned around, not because it had been defeated, not because the terrain stopped it, or the weather turned, or any enemy proved capable of standing against it. The great Khan Ogadai had died in Karakoram, and Mongol custom required the commanders to return for the succession assembly. The requirement built into the system, the same requirement that had held the empire together through 3 successions and expansions that reached from Korea to Poland, was the only thing that saved Western Europe from what came next. This is where the story of the fall begins. Not at a battle, not at a defeat, at a custom. Now look at the board as it stood in 1259. The Mongol Empire at that moment covered approximately 24 million square kilometers. It stretched from Korea in the east to the borders of Poland in the west, from Siberia in the north to Persia in the south. It was administered by a system that moved messages 1,000 miles in days, protected trade routes across the entire Eurasian landmass, and had not lost a major campaign in open terrain in more than 50 years. Every army that had tried to stop it had been destroyed. Every city that had refused to surrender had been erased. The system that produced these results had been running continuously for more than half a century, through the deaths of the man who built it and 2 of his successors, without losing its fundamental character. 3 things were happening simultaneously in 1259 that the people inside the empire could not yet see as connected. In southern China, the great Khan Möngke was personally leading the campaign against the Song dynasty in Sichuan province because 40 years of generals had failed to close it, and he had decided the campaign needed him. His army was bogged down in mud and rain and siege warfare and disease. He was drinking the water available to him. In the Middle East, his brother Hulagu had destroyed Baghdad, killed the caliph, and was preparing to move on Egypt, the last significant Islamic power remaining. His force was at maximum strength. Nothing had stopped him yet. In northern China and Mongolia, his other brother Kublai was watching the eastern campaign, while calculating what Möngke's death, which had not yet happened, would require him to do if it did. He was keeping his options open in a way the system had not been designed to accommodate. 3 brothers, 3 directions, 1 system holding them together. The system had been built on a foundation that Temujin had established at Baljuna in 1203, when he made a promise to 19 men at a drying lake. 1 center, loyalty above bloodline, everything shared. The empire that followed was the largest in history. It functioned because that principle held. What happens when the principle breaks is what this story is about. Every account of the Mongol Empire's collapse focuses on the battles it lost Ain Jalut in 1260, the typhoons off Japan in 1274 and 1281, the Red Turban Rebellion that ended the Yuan dynasty in China. The problem with that framing is that armies do not collapse after a century of unbroken success simply because they finally lose one battle. Something structural breaks first. The battles are symptoms. The question is what the disease was, and when it started, and whether the men inside the system could have seen it before it became visible in the outcomes. In 1262, Möngke Khan of the Golden Horde and Hulagu Khan of the Ilkhanate went to war with each other. Both were grandsons of Genghis Khan. Both commanded armies built by the same system, trained by the same methods, loyal to the same founding oath. Two Mongol rulers, neither of whom had ever visited the city whose destruction divided them, spent the resources of the largest empire in history fighting each other. Hulagu could not march on Egypt to reverse the defeat at Ain Jalut because his own cousin was attacking him from the north. The empire that had been unstoppable when unified became stoppable the moment it turned inward. The question is why the system that had prevented this for 60 years stopped preventing it at precisely that moment. And then there are the roads, the relay stations and protected corridors that made Pax Mongolica the most sophisticated commercial infrastructure the medieval world had ever seen. What those roads carried, and where it went, and what it did when it arrived, that is the last account the empire has to give. Before the army that turned around from the Adriatic could be built, it needed a reason to exist. Before it could fall apart, it needed a reason to hold together. Both reasons are the same reason. That is where this starts. The Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan's death in 1227 did not slow down. It accelerated. His son, Ogedei, completed the conquest of northern China. He pushed armies into Russia and Eastern Europe simultaneously. He established the first genuine administrative structure the empire had ever had. Branch secretariats across the conquered territories, responsible for taxation and civilian governance, answering to a central authority at Karakoram. For the first time, the empire was not simply a military machine moving across the landscape. It was a state. It had bureaucrats. It had procedures. It had something resembling a government. But the state had a structural requirement that the bureaucrats could not change and the procedures could not replace. The Mongol military system paid its warriors through plunder. This was not a policy decision that could be reversed by a reform-minded chancellor. It was the architecture of the system itself. The decimal organization that Temujin had built at the Kurultai of 1206 tied every warrior to a unit, every unit to a campaign, every campaign to a frontier that kept moving outward. The movement was the salary. A tumen of 10,000 warriors with the 5 horses per rider the system required needed to be fed, equipped, and compensated. The compensation came from what the frontier produced when it moved. When the frontier stopped moving, the system had nothing to distribute. This was not immediately visible during the reigns of Ogedei and Möngke because there was always another frontier available. Song China in the south, Persia and the Islamic world in the west, Eastern Europe beyond the steppe. The empire was large enough and the list of unconquered peoples long enough that the machine could keep running. The warriors kept being paid. The loyalty built into the system through shared plunder kept functioning. What it could not do was administer without expanding. The secretariats Ogedei had established were in constant tension with the Mongol princes who saw the conquered territories as existing to be exploited by the Chinggisid family rather than governed for the benefit of the population. The administrators wanted to protect and tax the conquered peoples in ways that would produce sustainable revenue. The princes wanted extraction. Between them stood the great Khan, whose personal authority was the only mechanism that kept the tension from becoming fracture. That authority rested on something that no succession could fully transfer. Temujin had earned the loyalty of the 19 men at Baljuna through specific acts toward specific people over years of shared hardship. The title passed to his successors. The quality that had generated it did not. Each new great Khan inherited a system that had been built to replicate that quality at institutional scale, but which required, at its center, the kind of person who could hold together men of different origins and interests through something other than procedure. Each succession made this problem slightly more acute. Ogadei confirmed through a proper Kurultai with the assembled princes. Guyuk's reign was brief and contested, sandwiched between regencies. Möngke seized power in 1251 by eliminating rivals on a scale that ensured confirmation, but reduced the pool of capable Chinggisids for future successions. Each elimination made the next succession marginally harder to resolve cleanly. Each succession produced winners who owed the non-Chinggisid military commanders, the Noyad, increasingly large debts for their support. The Noyad had been granted lands and peoples to sustain themselves. They had fought alongside the Chinggisids since Baljuna. They had built the empire alongside the family that ruled it. But they were not the family. Their authority derived from proximity to Chinggisid legitimacy, and as the Chinggisid pool thinned and the Khan's personal authority became more dependent on their military backing, the distance between nominal and actual power was closing in a direction the system had not been designed to accommodate. The machine was still running. The frontier was still moving. The salary was still being paid. But the structure underneath it was becoming thinner with each succession, each elimination of rivals, each campaign that required the empire to send armies to opposite ends of a territory so large that the commanders at those ends could no longer return to the center in time for the assemblies the system required. One sentence, filed and moved past. The warrior paid in plunder, who stops receiving plunder, does not stop being a warrior. He starts looking closer to home for what the frontier used to provide. That sentence will matter later. For now, consider what Möngke Khan decided to do in 1253, when he looked at the map of everything the empire had built and the map of everything it had not yet taken, and gave his brothers their orders. Hulagu Khan left Mongolia in 1255 with orders that had the clarity of someone who had thought carefully about what remained to be done. Destroy the assassins. Destroy the Abbasid Caliphate. Bring the Islamic world under Mongol control. Everything west of Persia that had not yet submitted was to submit. The campaign was not a raid or a punitive expedition. It was a completion, the final extension of a system that had been moving in this direction since the Kurultai of 1206. The assassins fell first. The Nizari Ismaili sect had controlled a network of mountain fortresses in northern Persia for 166 years, from which they conducted political murders across the Islamic world with a precision that had made even the Mongols cautious during earlier campaigns. Their principal stronghold at Meymandiz was considered by everyone who had studied it to be effectively impregnable. It sat on a mountain peak, supplied through routes that conventional armies could not easily cut, defended by men for whom death in the fortress's service was preferable to the alternative. Hulagu surrounded it in November 1256 with Chinese siege engineers carrying equipment the mountain fortresses had not been designed to resist. The Grand Master Rukn al-Din Kursha watched the position become untenable within days. He surrendered. He was promised safe passage. He was sent to the Great Khan in Karakoram. He was killed on the return journey. What happened to the library at Alamut is worth a specific note because it is a small window into how history is made and who makes it. The historian Juvayni, who was traveling with Hulagu's army and whose account remains the primary source for the campaign, was given access to the fortress before its destruction. He selected what he considered worth saving: copies of the Quran, some astronomical instruments, a small number of books he judged valuable. The rest was burned. The man whose account we rely on for what was lost was also the man who decided what would be lost. The history of what the assassins preserved and the history of what was destroyed from their collection are both, ultimately, Giovanni's history, shaped by Giovanni's judgment, on a day when Giovanni was the only scholar in the building. Baghdad fell on February 10th, 1258. The siege lasted 12 days. The Caliph al-Mustasim, who had refused to believe that God would permit the destruction of the center of Islamic spiritual authority, was captured, wrapped in a carpet, and trampled by horses. The Mongol execution reserved for those of sufficient standing that their blood should not touch the ground was applied to the man who had believed his standing would protect him from what it could not protect him from. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. The books entered the Tigris. Witnesses recorded that the river ran dark. What the sources describe and what contemporary scholarship treats carefully, because the specific numbers are contested, is the end of the Abbasid Caliphate that had governed the Islamic world for 5 centuries. The institutional knowledge of that governance, the libraries, the administrative traditions, the scholarly networks, all of it was disrupted in 12 days of siege and the days that followed. The accumulated intellectual infrastructure of the Islamic world center was gone in less than 2 weeks, and then something happened that the men who had ordered the destruction almost certainly did not consider as they were ordering it. The roads opened. The same routes that Hulagu's army had used to move west became, under Mongol administration, the most protected commercial corridors the medieval world had ever seen. A merchant with the proper documentation could now travel from the Black Sea to China under a single administrative authority that executed thieves and maintained relay stations with fresh horses every 25 miles. The tolls and political fragmentation and banditry that had made long-distance trade expensive and dangerous for centuries were, inside the empire's borders, replaced by a single system, with a single set of rules enforced by an administration that had demonstrated, comprehensively, what happened to people who violated its rules. What moved through that system was everything that could be profitably moved across a continent. Silk and spices, of course, but also printing technology, gunpowder, mathematical knowledge, navigation tools, the accumulated learning of the civilizations the empire had connected. The connection was real. Its consequences were documented and lasting. What else traveled through those routes, and what it did when it arrived at the other end, is the account that comes later. File it. Move on. Before Hulagu could press further west toward Egypt, the succession system began showing its first visible stress. The campaign in China was consuming Möngke's attention and resources. The assembly that would confirm the next great Khan required the presence of all major Chinggisid princes. Hulagu was watching east while looking west, aware that the message he did not yet know was coming would, when it came, pull everything he had built in Persia into the orbit of a problem he had not been sent west to solve. He reached Syria. Damascus surrendered without a siege in March 1260. The army that had destroyed Baghdad and absorbed Persia stood at the edge of Egypt with nothing yet in its way. There was one reason it did not cross that edge. The reason was dying in a military camp in Sichuan, drinking the water available to him, not yet knowing that his death would be the reason. Summer, 1259. a military camp in Sichuan province, southern China. The great Khan Möngke is dying. Take this slowly. He came here personally because the Song dynasty had held out for 40 years against every general he had sent. The terrain of southern China, the rivers, the fortified cities on cliff faces above floodplains, the rain that turned the ground into something that cavalry could not cross with the speed that cavalry required, had neutralized the advantages that had made the Mongol army invincible on open ground. Each general had returned with the same incomplete result and the same explanation. The campaign needed something that generals alone could not provide. Möngke decided it needed him. He crossed into Sichuan and found what his generals had found. The siege at Diaoyu fortress stalled. The summer heat in the river valleys was unlike anything an army trained on the Mongolian steppe had been designed to operate in. Disease moved through the camp, the way disease moves through any large concentration of men in hot weather near water sources that too many animals and too many people have been using for too long. Möngke drank the water available to him. He was the great Khan. There was no water in the camp that was not available to him. There was also no water in the camp that was not what it was, which was the water of a military camp in Sichuan in the summer of 1259, and which was making men sick and killing some of them, and which could not be made into something else by the authority of the person drinking it. The Chinese chronicle records that he died 8 days after he first felt ill. August 1259. He does not know, in the days between the illness and the death, what is happening 8,000 miles to the west, where Hulagu has moved into Syria and is positioning for the final campaign against Egypt. He does not know that the message carrying news of his illness and then of his death will reach Hulagu before Hulagu reaches Egypt, and that this specific sequence, this particular order of arrivals, will be the reason a battle called Ain Jalut happens with the force ratios that allow its outcome. He does not know that his brother Kublai, who has been watching the Eastern campaign while keeping his options open, has already begun calculating what to do if the message arrives before the traditional assembly can be organized. He does not know that his youngest brother, Ariq Boke, governing in Karakoram in Möngke's absence, has already been identified by the Central Secretariat as the most likely regent or successor, and is waiting for a message that has not yet been sent. He knows he is sick. He knows the campaign is stalled. He knows the army around him is also sick, dying not in the way warriors are trained to accept, but in the slow, undignified way of fever, in a camp far from the steppe. The messengers ride immediately when he dies. One goes west toward Persia, where Hulagu is. One goes east toward the Song frontier, where Kublai is. One goes north toward Karakoram, where Ariq is. The messages carry the same fact. What each recipient does with that fact is not determined by the fact. It is determined by everything each of them has wanted and feared and calculated for the years leading up to the moment the message arrives. Hulagu receives it while assembling the force for Egypt. The civil war the succession implies is already visible in the message's subtext. He begins withdrawing troops east, leaving a garrison in Syria under his general Kitbuka with approximately 12,000 men. Weeks earlier, the force available to him had been multiples of that number. Kublai receives it while campaigning. He does not return to Mongolia for the traditional assembly. He stays on the campaign, accumulating military victories he knows he will need, until a message from his wife in November 1259 tells him that Ariq is planning his own election for the following summer. Kublai does not go to Karakoram. He goes to his Chinese-style city at Shangdu near the Chinese border and begins organizing an election of his own. Ariq in Karakoram has the support of the traditional Mongol princes who distrust Kublai's preference for Chinese governance and Chinese ceremony. He organizes the traditional assembly. The system for choosing a great Khan had functioned for 30 years since Temujin's death. It required the assembled princes to confirm a candidate through a Kuriltai held in the Mongol homeland. The system had produced Ogedei, Guyuk, and Möngke. Each succession had been contested. Each had eventually resolved. The system had held because the geography of the empire at the time of each previous succession had still permitted the major actors to reach the center before the center became irrelevant. What was different now was the distance. The empire was simply too large for all the major princes to assemble in one place, without one of them abandoning a campaign that could not be abandoned. Kublai could not leave China without losing what he had built there. Hulagu could not leave Persia without losing what he had built there. The assembly the system required could not include the most powerful actors in the system without ending the campaigns that were the system's reason for existing. The machine had grown past the capacity of the mechanism designed to keep it whole. Möngke had known this tension was building. Whether he left instructions, whether he had a preference, whether he had a plan, the sources do not resolve with certainty. What is certain is that he drank the water available to him in a camp in Sichuan in the summer of 1259, and that the largest empire in human history began, from that moment, to move in the direction of fracture it had been approaching for years. He died. The messengers rode. The world changed its shape. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was the last significant Muslim military power remaining after Baghdad. The word Mamluk means owned in Arabic. The system that produced the army was built on the purchase of boys from the Kipchak Turkish steppe, their transport to Egypt as children, their training from childhood in mounted warfare, their conversion to Islam, and their eventual freedom when they came of age to become the military aristocracy of the state they had been raised to serve. The system had produced something that had not existed before in quite this form. An army whose warriors shared the same steppe origins as the Mongols, understood cavalry warfare at the same instinctive level, and had spent their careers fighting in the specific terrain of the Levant rather than arriving in it for the first time. The Sultan in 1260 was Qutuz, who had seized power the previous year with the specific purpose of organizing resistance to the Mongol advance. His field commander was Baybars, tall and powerfully built, with blue eyes and a cataract in one of them that had nearly prevented his sale into slavery when his first owner considered it an ill omen. The omen had been misread. Baybars had grown up on the same Kipchak steppe that had produced the Mongol army's tactical tradition. He understood feigned retreat not as a technique to be learned, but as a way of fighting that his body already knew. The Mongol garrison commander in Syria was Kitbuka Noyan, a Nestorian Christian and one of Hulagu's most trusted generals, left in charge of approximately 12,000 men in a region that the campaign had been designed for a force many times that size. Kitbuka had specific disadvantages that the battle's outcome tends to obscure when the outcome is treated as inevitable. His horses were steppe horses, small and fast, and extraordinarily suited to the open grasslands of Central Asia, but not shod with iron. The rocky ground of the Jezreel Valley wore unshod hooves quickly, degrading the speed and responsiveness that made Mongol cavalry effective. The Syrian summer of 1260 was hotter and drier than average, reducing the available grazing in a region that was already marginal for the number of horses the Mongol military system required. A force of 12,000 Mongol cavalry carried roughly 60,000 horses. feeding 60,000 horses on semi-arid terrain after a campaign that had already moved through the region and consumed what the land had available, was a logistics problem that could not be solved by tactical skill. The Mamluk horses were Arabian breeds, larger and heavier, shod with iron, fed on barley brought from Egypt. They were suited to exactly this terrain in a way the Mongol horses were not. Baybars drew Kitbuka's army into the valley of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, where the surrounding hills limited the flanking maneuvers the Mongol system had used to destroy larger armies on open ground. He used feigned retreat, the same tactic the Mongols had used from the Kalka River to Legnica, pulling Kitbuka's force into committed ground before the main Mamluk army came down from the hills. Kitbuka was killed. The garrison was destroyed. What Ain Jalut proved was specific and limited. It proved that a Mongol garrison of 12,000, operating in terrain that degraded their horses and in an ecological environment that was starving those horses of the grazing they needed, could be defeated by a prepared force of 20,000 that had grown up in the same tactical tradition and had specifically selected terrain that neutralized the garrison's remaining advantages. It did not prove that the Mongol army had been stopped. It proved that this force, in these conditions, at this moment, could be stopped. Reuven Amitai, whose study of the Mongol-Mamluk wars is the current academic standard, treats Ain Jalut as militarily significant, but contextually contingent. The conditions that made the outcome possible were not the permanent conditions of the contest between the two powers. J.M. Smith argued that the Mongols could never have held Syria regardless, because the ecology of the region simply could not support the number of horses the Mongol military system required, even at full strength. Both arguments have documentary support. They are not answering the same question. Hulagu understood, when the news reached him, that the garrison's destruction was a setback and not a verdict. He assembled a new army. The calculation was straightforward. The Mamluks had won one battle with a depleted force in favorable terrain. A full campaign at full strength would produce a different result. The window that Kitbuka's defeat had opened for the Mamluks would close. Then the second message arrived, following the first by weeks. Kublai and Ariq Boke had both declared themselves Great Khan. The civil war the succession had been building toward had begun. The army Hulagu had been assembling for Egypt was needed for the east. His cousin Berke of the Golden Horde, who had converted to Islam and viewed the destruction of Baghdad as a crime that demanded response, was moving forces toward Hulagu's northern border. Hulagu was being attacked from inside the empire at the same moment he was preparing to attack outside it. The Egypt campaign was suspended. It was never resumed at full scale. The Mamluks would face Mongol armies again. At Homs in 1299, Hulagu's grandson Ghazan would defeat a Mamluk force and briefly occupy Damascus. But the campaign that would have arrived with the full weight of an undivided empire never came, because by the time the civil war was resolved, the empire was no longer undivided, and what had been divided could not be reassembled into what it had been before. Hulagu had the army. He had the motivation. He had the strategic logic, one campaign with full force against an enemy that had won on odds that would not repeat. The question is not whether he made the right decision in suspending the campaign. He did not decide. The succession decided for him. The deeper question is whether there was a version of the Möngke succession that held the center long enough for the system to adapt, or whether the fracture was already written into the system by the time Möngke drank the water in Sichuan. Whether the empire that turned around from the Adriatic in 1242 was already carrying the conditions of its dissolution inside it at the moment of its greatest reach. We do not know. Move forward. In the spring of 1260, Kublai Khan had himself declared Great Khan at Chengdu. Chengdu was a Chinese-style city near the Chinese border, built in imitation of Chinese urban design, used previously as a quasi-capital in a way that had already gotten Kublai removed from authority by Möngke for its cultural symbolism. The election was held without representation from the other branches of the Chinggisid family. It was not held in Karakorum or along the Onon River, where Temujin had been acclaimed in 1206. It was accompanied by Chinese ceremonial trappings, a Chinese era name, the formal adoption of administrative symbolism that the traditional Mongol princes had been watching with increasing unease for years. By the standards the system had used for 40 years, the election was illegitimate. It lacked what every previous Kuriltai had possessed: the assembled princes of all the major Chinggisid lines, confirming a candidate in the homeland, in the manner that Temujin's successors had confirmed each other since 1227. Ariq Boke held his own election in July 1260. It was conducted in Karakorum, with the support of the Central Secretariat, with the backing of the princes who wanted Mongol governance to remain Mongol rather than becoming Chinese. By every procedural standard the system recognized, Ariq's election was the legitimate one. He had the right location, the right assembly, the right institutional support. For the first time since Temujin had unified the steppe, there were two great Khans simultaneously. The civil war lasted until 1264, when Ariq surrendered to Kublai. The sources that favored Kublai portrayed Ariq as a rebel against legitimate authority. The sources are Kublai's sources. What the sequence of events actually shows is that Kublai moved first, held the Chinese territories and their revenues, and outlasted a brother who had the traditional legitimacy, but not the economic base to sustain a prolonged campaign. Kublai won because he controlled China. He controlled China because he had spent years building relationships there that Möngke had punished him for, and that the civil war vindicated. When Kublai invited the major Chinggisid princes to a Kuriltai after Ariq's surrender to confirm his election and determine Ariq's fate, none of them came. Not one. The precedent of two simultaneous Khans had established, in the most practical terms available, that a prince who disagreed with the current Great Khan's election could simply decline to recognize it. The mechanism that had resolved every previous succession by requiring physical presence and formal confirmation had been broken by the civil war, and the breaking could not be undone by the war's resolution. Kublai was the Great Khan. The Western Khanates were independent powers. Both things were simultaneously true, and neither canceled the other. What Temujin had built at Baljuna in 1203 was a principle before it was a system. 19 men at a drying lake had stayed because of a specific person, and the promise that person made had become the foundation of an empire. The system built on that foundation was designed to replicate the principle institutionally, to make the loyalty that had been personal into something procedural that could function after the person was gone. For 60 years, it functioned. The decimal organization, the Keshig, the Yasa, the Kuriltai, all of it held the center through 3 successions and expansions across a geography that should have made holding the center impossible. What the system could not do was resolve the specific ambiguity that 1260 produced. 2 candidates, 2 legitimate claims under different interpretations of the same procedures. 1 center that could not hold 2. Jamuga had told Temujin at the end that there could only be 1 sun in the sky. 2 suns did not exist in a single sky. He had been describing his own worldview. his own reason for refusing to survive in a world where Temujin's system had displaced everything Jamuga understood. But he had also been describing the system itself, accurately, from the outside, in the moment before the system consumed him. The system required one center. When it produced two, it had no mechanism for healing the division. It could only produce a winner and leave the fracture permanent. Kublai won. The empire did not reunify. From the 1260s onward, the Khanates treated each other as foreign powers, exchanged embassies, fought border wars, and maintained the fiction of Chinggisid unity in correspondence, while the substance of it disappeared into the specific logic of each Khanate's own survival. The machine, after the man had become several smaller machines, each one was still running. Each one was running on the same fuel, toward the same terminal condition, at its own pace. The Ilkhanate, built by Hulagu on the ruins of Baghdad, lasted until 1335. Its collapse followed a pattern that the historian Charles Melville identified with particular clarity: a widening gap between the military elite and the Khan, whose authority they were theoretically serving but increasingly directing. The Noyad, the non-Chinggisid generals who had been granted lands and peoples to sustain themselves since the days of the original campaigns, had built their own power bases across the conquered territories. They had backed the winning candidates in each succession. They expected, in return, a Khan who would govern in ways that preserved their privileges rather than reforming them away. The Khans who converted to Islam, who built public mausoleums rather than the traditional secret Mongol burials, who ended the war with the Mamluks by diplomacy rather than conquest. Each of these decisions was, in the logic of the Noyad, an abandonment of what it meant to be Mongol. The military elite that had been raised in the tradition of Temujin's meritocracy found themselves serving a dynasty that was becoming Persian faster than it was remaining Mongol. Their stake in the Chinggisid system diminished as the system itself became something they no longer recognized as the thing they had signed on to serve. The last effective Khan was Abu Sa'id, who died in 1335 at 30 years old, without an heir. The line of Hulagu had reduced itself through what scholars including Anne Broadbridge have identified as compounding inbreeding across the same preferred marriage networks, generation after generation, to a fertility crisis that no administrative solution could address. Hulagu himself had produced at least 25 children. By the time of his grandson Ghazan, only a daughter survived childhood. Ghazan's brother Oljatu had 3 children reach marriageable age from 12 wives. Abu Sa'id, despite considerable effort, managed to impregnate only one woman, his widow, who delivered his only child after his death. The line of Hulagu ended not in battle, but in biology. From 1335 to 1353, 8 different Khans were declared by competing military commanders, most of them known to history only by their names and the names of the men who controlled them. The pretext of an Ilkhanate was maintained until the fiction became too thin to sustain even as fiction. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented along a line that recurred across all the successor states, with variations specific to each one. The tension between the population that retained Mongol nomadic identity and the population that had been absorbed into the urbanized culture of the conquered territories. The Khans who governed from the wealthy cities of Transoxania in the west alienated the nomadic lords of the eastern steppe, who felt the old ways being abandoned. The eastern lords installed their own candidates. By 1347, the Khanate had formally divided into 2 rival states, both claiming to be the legitimate heir of Chagatai. neither capable of reunifying what the original system had held together only as long as there was a functioning center to hold it. From the ruins of the Western fragment, a commander named Timur, who the West would call Tamerlane, built a new empire by claiming Mongol legitimacy through his wife's bloodline rather than his own. He never called himself Khan. He ruled through puppet Chinggisids, whose names appear on the coins and in the official correspondence, while Timur's name appears in the histories. The fiction of Chinggisid legitimacy outlasted the Chinggisids themselves because the legitimacy had become a brand, and brands can be licensed by people who did not build them. The Yuan dynasty in China ran the reward system until the reward system ran out. When Kublai finally conquered the Song dynasty in 1279, completing the work that had begun under Genghis Khan 60 years earlier, the Mongol Empire had absorbed its last major territorial expansion in Asia. The campaigns against Japan failed twice, the first fleet destroyed by a typhoon in 1274, and the second by a combination of Mamluk-style prepared resistance from the Japanese defenders and another catastrophic storm in 1281. The campaigns into Southeast Asia and Vietnam failed for reasons the steppe system had no answer for: jungle terrain, tropical disease, supply lines that extended past the point where they could sustain an army built for speed across open ground. The frontier had run out of places to go. The solution to paying warriors without plunder was paper money. The currency needed to be backed by something. That something was agricultural production and trade revenue and taxation, all of which depended on conditions that the 14th century made progressively impossible to maintain. The Little Ice Age began asserting itself across the Yuan territories in the 1290s. The Yangtze River Delta, the most agriculturally productive region of the empire, began experiencing annual floods, droughts, locust plagues, and typhoons that destroyed farmland across hundreds of miles of coastline. The Yellow River broke its banks repeatedly. In Mongolia, harsh winters killed herds and drove thousands south, demanding relief from the Khan. From 1272 until 1357, there was a major famine somewhere in China almost every other year. The government relief system that Kublai had established, which the dynasty could not abolish without losing the legitimacy that distinguished it from the conquests that had preceded it, was being asked to respond to a century of climatic emergency across a territory the size of a continent. To fund relief, more currency was printed. Inflation followed. More was printed to compensate. By the 1340s, Yuan paper money was losing value faster than it was being issued. The warriors who had once been paid in the plunder of Song cities were now being paid in currency that approached worthlessness. The frontier that had been the salary was gone. The money that had replaced it was becoming nothing. The machine designed to pay its operators through expansion was trying to operate without expanding, in a climate that was destroying the agricultural base that paper money required to mean anything. The Red Turban rebellions that erupted in 1351 were what a population looks like when it has received catastrophe for a decade and worthless currency as compensation. The Yuan Chancellor Tokto came close to suppressing them, close enough that his dismissal by the Khan at the critical moment transformed what had been a manageable rebellion into the uprising that made the Ming dynasty possible. Tokto accepted the dismissal. He was assassinated the following year. The Khan who had dismissed him continued to govern with the specific combination of anxiety and passivity that the sources describe consistently across his entire reign. The last Yuan forces withdrew from Beijing in 1368. The Ming dynasty was declared. The reward system had reached its terminal expression. The machine that required expansion to pay itself had printed money to replace the expansion it could no longer generate, in a climate that made the money worthless as fast as it was printed, until the people who were supposed to be paid rose up and ended it. The Golden Horde outlasted every other successor state by generations. While the Ilkhanate was fragmenting into puppet khans and the Yuan dynasty was printing worthless currency against a century of floods and locusts, the Golden Horde was still functioning as a coherent power across the Western Steppe and the Rus principalities. Its khans remained nomadic. They maintained the steppe identity that the Il Khans had gradually abandoned in the direction of Persian culture, and the Yuan Khans had abandoned in the direction of Chinese culture. The Rus princes who had paid tribute to Batu Khan since the 1240s were still making the journey to the Horde's court to request confirmation of their right to rule, still paying what the system required, still operating inside the framework that the conquest had imposed on them. The golden age of the Horde was the 30-year reign of Khan Ozbeg in the early 14th century. Under Ozbeg, the steppe cities reached their maximum size and complexity. The archaeological remains of Sarai al-Jadid, the Horde's largest settlement, stretch 7 kilometers along the Aktuba River. At its height, it may have housed 75,000 people, craftsmen, merchants, administrators, the support infrastructure of a nomadic empire that had grown sedentary enough to need cities without becoming sedentary enough to stop being what it was. Trade moved through the overland routes. Agricultural production expanded into the Ukrainian steppes. The system that Temujin had built for movement across the grassland had, in the Golden Horde, produced something stable enough to sustain permanent settlement. Then the climate turned in the same direction it was turning everywhere else. The same little ice age that was destroying harvests in China was reducing precipitation across the Eurasian steppe, steadily from the 1280s, and then precipitously after 1320. For an economy built on herds and horses and grassland, a sustained reduction in the productivity of the steppe was not a policy problem that could be addressed by a capable chancellor. It was the ground itself becoming less than what the system required it to be. The cities that had grown dependent on the herd economy found their supply chains failing. The Caspian Sea rose, flooding the low-lying agricultural land in the Volga Delta that had been feeding the cities downstream. The disintegration of the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate in the 1330s unraveled the overland trade that had enriched the Horde's commercial centers. Then in 1346, the army of Khan Jani Beg was besieging the Genoese trading post at Kaffa on the Crimean coast, and the soldiers were dying of something that was not a wound. The disease moved through the camp with a speed and indifference that no military discipline could address. A Genoese notary named Gabriele de Musis recorded what happened next. Johnny Beg's forces catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa. Whether this was a deliberate act of biological warfare or a desperate response to a situation the commanders could not otherwise control, the mechanics of what followed were the same. The Genoese ships that fled Kaffa in 1346 carried the disease to Sicily. From Sicily, it moved to the Italian peninsula, to France, to the Iberian Peninsula, to England, to Scandinavia. The Black Death killed between a third and half of Europe's population in the years that followed, the largest single mortality event in European recorded history to that point. The plague did not originate at Kaffa. It had been moving through the steppe and the Horde cities for years before it reached the Crimean coast. the overcrowded trading cities that Pax Mongolica had created, the dense commercial nodes where the overland routes converged and the populations concentrated, were the mechanism through which the disease amplified before it reached the ships that carried it west. One source records 85,000 dead in Crimea alone before the siege. The same density of population that had made the horde cities productive had made them catastrophically vulnerable to what was moving through the steppe. After Jani Beg died in 1357, the dynasty's stability collapsed with a speed that suggested it had been more fragile than its longevity implied. His sons killed each other. The line of Batu was extinguished. Over the following 20 years, more than 25 men claimed the throne, some of them known to history, only from coins minted briefly in their names, before the next claimant had them removed. The Rus princes, who had been paying tribute for a century, stopped making the journey to request confirmation. The Prince of Moscow defeated a horde army at Kulikovo in 1380, was sacked by Toktamish 2 years later, and continued the specific negotiation between submission and resistance that characterized the Rus' relationship with the horde across its final century. What ended the Golden Horde was not a single defeat, and not a single cause. It was the same sequence of pressures that had ended the other Khanates, arriving at a different pace across a different landscape. The reward system finding no new frontier to pay itself from, the succession producing more candidates than the mechanism could resolve, the climate degrading the ecological foundation the nomadic economy required, and something else traveling through the infrastructure the system had built, something that had been moving west through the Mongol trade routes since before anyone on the western end of those routes knew what was coming. That something needs its own account. It is the last account the empire has to give. 3 questions were asked at the beginning of this story. They have answers now, as close as the evidence allows. The first, what broke the empire was not the battles it lost. The structural failure was built into the system at the Kurultai of 1206 and became visible only when the specific conditions that had kept it functional stopped existing simultaneously. The moving frontier that paid the warriors. The geography small enough for the assembly system to work. The succession that produced one center rather than 2. All 3 stopped working within a decade of each other, triggered by a death in a military camp in Sichuan that nobody had planned for, and that the system had no mechanism to survive cleanly at the scale the empire had reached. The battles at Ain Jalut and off Japan were expressions of the failure. The disease in Möngke's camp was the trigger for a fracture that had been developing for decades. Both things are true simultaneously. Neither is sufficient alone. The second, the Berke Hulagu War began because the Möngke succession produced 2 competing centers simultaneously, and the Great Khan's authority, which had previously existed as a unified force, capable of mediating between the branches of the family, no longer existed in that form. Berke's conversion to Islam and his rage at the destruction of Baghdad were real. The territorial dispute over the Caucasus was equally real. In any previous decade, the Great Khan would have arbitrated. There was no Great Khan both parties recognized. The principle that Temujin had established at Baljuna, that there could be only one center, that the betrayal of that principle was the worst possible act, ended not with a betrayal, but with a procedure that the empire's own growth had made impossible to execute correctly. The system did not fail because someone broke it. It failed because the empire became too large for it to function as designed, and when it failed, it produced exactly the outcome it had been designed to prevent. The third, whether the connection was worth the plague, does not resolve. The infrastructure was not designed to carry the disease. could not have been known to carry it, and carried it anyway, because infrastructure moves what is present to be moved without asking what it is. The people who built the relay stations were building the most sophisticated commercial network the medieval world had seen. They were also, without knowing it, building the most efficient transmission system available for the pathogen that was moving toward it from the mountains of Central Asia. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. The Mongol Empire at its maximum extent covered 24 million square kilometers and administered a population of perhaps 100 million people under a system built by a man who had drunk mud from a drying lake with 19 followers at its lowest point. The specific consequences of what it built and destroyed and transmitted and delivered are still measurable in the world. The Great Wall of China as it exists today was built by the Ming dynasty that replaced the Yuan, built to the scale it was built because the fear the Mongols had generated outlasted the empire that generated it. Columbus was looking for the Asia that Marco Polo had described at Kublai's court, the Asia the Mongol trade network had made legible to European imagination, when he found instead 2 continents that changed the shape of the world. The labor shortages after the Black Death gave European peasants bargaining power that accelerated the end of feudalism and the social reorganization that made the modern European state possible. The public health infrastructure of every major city in the world descends, in some part, from what European cities built after 1350, when they learned what connected populations meant for the movement of disease. These are roads the empire built. Some of them carried wealth. Some of them carried knowledge. One of them carried the plague. All of them are still in use. In 1242, a Mongol army turned around from the Adriatic because a great Khan had died and the custom required the commanders to return. The custom was the system. The system had made the empire. The empire had grown past the system's capacity to hold it. The army that turned around from the edge of everything was already, without knowing it, carrying the conditions of the ending inside it. Nobody dismantled it. It became too large for the thing that built it. That is a different kind of ending.